Los Angeles, 2013. A 21-year-old honors student on her first solo trip vanished inside a notorious downtown hotel after sending one last cryptic text. The only trace left behind was a haunting piece of security footage showing her in an elevator, seemingly hiding from an unseen presence. The bizarre video went viral, leading police to theorize she had suffered a sudden, tragic psychotic break. But while the official investigation stalled, hotel guests began complaining about foul-tasting, discolored water. The truth was finally discovered on the roof, submerged inside a sealed water tank, revealing a history of deadly negligence the hotel had desperately tried to keep hidden. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you the story. The Sterling Hotel did not rise from the Los Angeles skyline so much as haunt it. It was a decaying Art Deco tooth in the city's sprawling, indifferent smile, a 12-story monument to a glamour that had curdled decades ago. Its ornate, grimy facade spoke of a time when movie stars and mobsters drank cocktails in its lobby, but the flickering neon sign now cast a jaundiced, desperate glow on the transient souls who shuffled in and out of its tarnished brass doors. It was a place of last resorts and cheap tourist deals, a vertical neighborhood of ghosts and people trying to become them. Into this world stepped Imani Green, a 21-year-old honors psychology major from Atlanta, her carry-on suitcase rolling quietly across the cracked marble floor of the lobby. She was on her first solo trip, a journey that was both a mandatory orientation for a study abroad program and a personal pilgrimage to a mental health seminar she had been looking forward to for months. She was a planner, a scholar, a young woman who saw the world as a series of fascinating, interconnected patterns of human behavior. The Sterling Hotel, booked online for its shockingly low price and its proximity to the seminar, was simply another pattern to observe. The air in the lobby was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dust, industrial cleaner, and a faint Swedish odor of decay she couldn't quite place. The man behind the plexiglass barrier at the front desk was sallow and uninterested, his eyes holding the profound weariness of someone who had seen too much and been paid too little for it. He slid a tarnished brass key across the counter, a real key, not a key card, a detail Imani found quaintly unsettling, and pointed her towards a rickety, cage-like elevator at the far end of the hall. Her room on the 9th floor was a study in faded elegance and modern neglect. A grand carved headboard was bolted to a wall with peeling, water-stained wallpaper. The carpet, once a rich crimson, was now a threadbare map of countless anonymous journeys. But the bed was made, and from the tall, narrow window, she could see the electric, chaotic beauty of the city lights spreading out below. She felt a thrill of independence, of being an adult on a mission in a new, exciting city. She unpacked her books, arranged her toiletries on the cracked porcelain of the bathroom sink, and sat on the edge of the bed. She pulled out her phone and sent a series of texts to her mother, Lorraine, back in Atlanta. She detailed her flight, the cab ride, her initial impressions of the city. Then, she wrote the final message. Made it safe rooms kinda weird but cheap. The whole hotel has a strange vibe, like it's holding its breath. See? Analyzing already. Talk to you tomorrow after the orientation. Love you. She hit send, unaware that this simple, loving message would become the last thread connecting her to the world she knew. She turned off the main light, leaving only the dim glow of a bedside lamp. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the strange groans and sighs of the old building, she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by the room itself, by the hotel. It was a fleeting, irrational thought, one she dismissed as the nervous energy of a first-time solo traveler. But as she drifted off to sleep, the feeling lingered, a quiet, persistent hum of wrongness in the very bones of the Sterling Hotel. Back in Atlanta, in a quiet, immaculate suburban home, Lorraine Green was a portrait of professional calm. As a retired nurse, she was a woman who understood process, who trusted in schedules, and who did not succumb to baseless panic. Her life was one of order, and the most reliable, cherished part of that order was her daily communication with her daughter, Imani. They were more than mother and daughter. They were best friends. Two halves of a conversation that had been ongoing for 21 years. So, when her scheduled 9 p.m. call from Imani didn't come through on Tuesday night, Lorraine felt a flicker of annoyance, not alarm. Imani was a responsible young woman, but she was also a 21-year-old on her first solo adventure. She was probably out exploring, her phone silenced, her mind captivated by the newness of Los Angeles. Lorraine left a calm, loving voicemail. "Just checking in, sweetie. Hope you're having a wonderful time. Call me when you get a chance," and went about her evening routine. But by Wednesday morning, when her follow-up text went unanswered, the flicker of annoyance began to smolder into a low, steady burn of anxiety. This was not like Imani. Even on her busiest days at college, she would send a quick heart emoji, a one-word reply, something to let her mother know she was okay. The silence was out of character, a disruption in the fundamental rhythm of their relationship. Lorraine's training as a nurse kicked in, a methodical process of elimination. She logged into Imani's flight and hotel confirmation emails, which her daughter had dutifully shared with her. She called the front desk of the Sterling Hotel. The same weary, uninterested voice she had heard in the background of Imani's call 2 nights ago answered. "I'm trying to reach my daughter, Imani Green, in room 912, Lorraine said, her voice a model of forced composure. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of indifferent typing. "No answer in the room, ma'am. Could you please send someone to check on her? She was supposed to call me last night and I'm worried." Another sigh, the sound of a man burdened by the emotional needs of strangers. "Look, lady, we're not a babysitting service. The do not disturb sign is on her door. Hotel policy is we don't bother the guests." The man's callous dismissal did not anger Lorraine. It terrified her. It was a wall, the first of many she would encounter. Her next call was to the university that was hosting the study abroad orientation. The program coordinator, a helpful, efficient woman, checked her list. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Green, but Imani did not check in for the orientation this morning. We had her on our list, but she was a no-show." That was the moment the smoldering anxiety ignited into a full-blown, 5-alarm fire of maternal dread. Imani would not miss that orientation. She had been preparing for it for months. It was the entire purpose of her trip. Her daughter was not irresponsible. She was not a flake. She was meticulous. She was dedicated, and she was now, officially, missing. Lorraine's professionalism dissolved, replaced by the raw, primal instinct of a mother whose child is in danger. She booked the first available flight to Los Angeles, her hands shaking as she entered her credit card information. She threw clothes into a suitcase, her mind a frantic, chaotic storm of terrifying possibilities. Every news story she had ever seen, every cautionary tale she had ever heard, was now playing on a loop in her head. She was no longer a retired nurse. She was a mother on a mission, flying across the country towards a decaying, indifferent hotel, armed with nothing but the absolute, unshakable certainty that her daughter was in trouble, and that the silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a life in peril. The LAPD's downtown precinct was a world away from Lorraine Green's quiet Atlanta suburb. It was a place of controlled chaos, of ringing phones and the low, constant murmur of human misery being processed and filed. When Lorraine arrived, her face etched with a sleepless, cross-country terror, she was met with the weary, procedural calm of a system designed to manage expectations. Missing persons cases involving young adults were common, and the unspoken assumption was almost always the same. They had run off, changed their minds, or simply chosen to disconnect. But Lorraine's quiet, fierce, and articulate certainty, the sheer force of her maternal conviction, managed to cut through the bureaucratic apathy. Her case was assigned to a detective from the Robbery Homicide Division, a quiet 44-year-old man named Calvin Rogers. He had a reputation for being methodical, for listening more than he spoke, and for treating every case not as a statistic, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. He listened to Lorraine's story, his gaze steady and patient, and for the first time since she had landed in Los Angeles, she felt heard. Rogers's first official act was to secure a warrant for the Sterling Hotel's security footage. He and his partner drove to the hotel, the tension between them and the hotel's manager, Diane Foster, immediate and palpable. Foster was all forced smiles and corporate jargon, her primary concern clearly the hotel's reputation, not a missing guest. She handed over the DVR tapes with a reluctant sigh, as if the police presence were a greater tragedy than the disappearance itself. Back at the precinct, Rogers and his team began the painstaking process of reviewing the footage. For hours, they saw nothing but the mundane, ghostly ballet of life in the Sterling. Tourists dragging suitcases, long-term residents shuffling through the lobby, staff moving with a practiced, weary efficiency. They tracked Imani's initial arrival, saw her check in, and watched her get on the elevator. And then, they found it. The footage that would turn a routine missing person case into a viral international mystery. The clip was from an elevator camera, dated the night of Imani's arrival. The timestamp read 1:17 a.m. The video was grainy, the quality poor, but the subject was unmistakably Imani. When the clip began, she was alone, stepping into the elevator. She pressed the button for her floor, the 9th, and then, inexplicably, she pressed several others in succession. The doors began to close, but she lunged forward, pressing the door open button, her movements jerky and anxious. She peered out into the hallway, her head snapping from left to right, as if looking for someone. Then, she jumped back into the elevator, pressing herself into the corner, trying to make herself small, as if hiding. The doors slid shut again. The elevator didn't move, as she had pressed the hold button. What happened next was the most bizarre part. She stepped cautiously back to the doorway and began to gesture with her hands, her arms moving in a strange, almost conversational way, as if she were talking to someone just out of the camera's view. She would gesture, then retreat back into the elevator, a fearful, almost playful look on her face. This went on for nearly 2 minutes. Finally, she stepped out of the elevator and off to the left, out of the camera's frame. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its ascent, empty. Rogers and his team watched the footage 3 times, the room silent. It was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Was she playing a game? Was she with someone? Or was this, as one of the younger detectives suggested, evidence of a sudden, severe psychotic break, perhaps induced by drugs? The video was a Rorschach test of horrors, its ambiguity allowing for a dozen terrifying interpretations. Within days, the footage was leaked to the media. It exploded online. "The ghost in the elevator," the headline screamed. Amateur sleuths from around the world began dissecting the video frame by frame, spinning elaborate theories of paranormal encounters, secret societies, and government conspiracies. The bizarre, haunting video became the public face of the investigation, and in doing so, it cemented the official narrative before the real investigation had even begun. The responsible, honors student had simply lost her mind. With the elevator footage shaping the public and departmental narrative, Detective Calvin Rogers found himself in a frustratingly familiar position, investigating a case that his superiors already considered solved. The theory of a sudden mental health crisis was neat, it was simple, and it absolved the Sterling Hotel of any responsibility. But to Rogers, it felt too easy, a convenient explanation for a deeply inconvenient set of circumstances. He believed that the truth of Imani's disappearance was not in the elevator, but in the decaying, secretive bones of the hotel itself. His investigation shifted from the victim to the location, and he was met with a wall of institutional silence that was as thick and as grimy as the hotel's own walls. His primary antagonist was the hotel manager, Diane Foster. She was a woman who had perfected the art of the non-answer, a corporate soldier whose only mission was to protect the Sterling's tarnished brand. Every request Rogers made was met with a bureaucratic delay or a polite, evasive refusal. "Access to the rooftop?" she'd say, her smile tight and insincere. "Oh, I'm afraid that's impossible. It's a restricted area due to insurance liabilities. We had an issue with the alarm system up there. So for guest safety, it's been completely sealed off for months." "Personnel files for your maintenance staff?" Rogers would ask. We'd need to have our corporate legal team review that request, Detective. Employee privacy is something we take very seriously here at the Sterling. It was a masterful performance of obstruction, all delivered with the plausible deniability of a concerned, by-the-book manager. But Rogers saw through it. He began to conduct his own, more subtle investigation of the building. He walked the halls, floor by floor, noticing the things that weren't on the official blueprints. He found maintenance access doors, unmarked and tucked away in service corridors, that were secured with heavy-duty padlocks that looked far newer than the decaying doors they were on. He noted the pervasive, almost deliberate state of disrepair. The flickering lights in the stairwells, the security cameras that were either broken or pointed at useless angles, the general air of a place that had been allowed to fester, a place where secrets could easily be kept. His attempts to interview the hotel staff were equally fruitless. The maids, the bellhops, the front desk clerks, they were a revolving door of transient, low-wage workers, many of whom seemed frightened, their eyes constantly darting towards the manager's office. They spoke in rehearsed, generic phrases. "Nice girl," kept to herself. Didn't see anything unusual. It was clear they had been coached, their fear of losing their jobs far greater than any sense of civic duty. The hotel itself was an active antagonist in his investigation. It was a labyrinth of locked doors, deleted records, and terrified employees. The wall of silence was not just a passive result of fear. It was an active, deliberate strategy of concealment. Rogers realized he was not just looking for a missing person. He was investigating a place, an institution with a long, dark history of swallowing people whole. The official narrative had closed the book on Imani Green, but for Detective Rogers, the hotel's very resistance was the most compelling evidence he had that the real story was still locked somewhere inside its rotting, Art Deco heart. While Detective Rogers was running into the hotel's institutional walls, a more insidious and elemental problem was beginning to seep through its physical ones. The first complaints were minor, easily dismissed as the typical grumblings of guests in a budget hotel. A British tourist couple, in town to see the sights, called the front desk to complain that the water pressure in their 10th floor room was little more than a trickle. The night manager, with a practiced, weary sigh, promised to send maintenance in the morning and promptly forgot about it. A long-term resident on the 7th floor, a man who had lived within the Sterling's decaying walls for over a decade, noticed that the water from his tap, usually clear, now had a faint, yellowish-brown tint. He didn't complain. In a place like the Sterling, you learned not to. But within a day, the trickle of complaints became a steady, insistent stream. Guests from the upper floors were now reporting that the water, when it did come out, was almost black for the first few seconds, and that it carried a strange, sweetish, and deeply unpleasant taste. A family from the Midwest, in town for a convention, reported that both of their young children had become violently ill after drinking from the bathroom tap. The front desk became a battleground of angry, disgusted guests. The staff, armed with a new set of scripted responses from management, tried to placate them. "We're experiencing some temporary issues with the city's water main. It's likely just rust from the old pipes. We recommend you let the water run for a few minutes before use." The situation was escalating into a full-blown crisis. The hotel's Yelp page, already a gallery of grim reviews, was now flooded with new one-star warnings about the foul water. One guest posted a photo of a glass filled with a cloudy brownish liquid, with the caption, "Do not drink the water at the Sterling Hotel." The problem was no longer a secret. It was becoming a public health hazard and a public relations nightmare. The narrative of the tainted water created a powerful, visceral sense of dread that permeated the entire building. The very element of life, the thing guests used to drink, to bathe, to brush their teeth, had become a source of revulsion and fear. The hotel, which had been so successful at stonewalling the police investigation, was now facing a rebellion from within, a problem that could not be dismissed with a corporate smile or a locked door. The building itself seemed to be rejecting a dark secret, forcing it to the surface in the most elemental and unavoidable way possible. The pressure was building, both literally in the hotel's ancient plumbing and figuratively on the hotel's evasive management. They were being forced to act, to finally look at the one part of the hotel they had so desperately tried to keep hidden, the one place where the water for the entire building was stored, the roof. The man tasked with solving the Sterling Hotel's water problem was a maintenance worker named Miguel. He was a man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a quiet, resigned demeanor. A man who had worked at the hotel for 15 years and had seen it all. He had been given a direct, non-negotiable order from a frantic Diane Foster. Get up to the roof and figure out why the water pressure was failing. Miguel hated the roof. It was a place of blistering sun, howling winds, and precarious, rusting infrastructure. But an order was an order. He took the creaking service elevator to the top floor and then climbed a steep, narrow metal ladder that led to a heavy, squealing access hatch. Pushing it open, he stepped out onto the vast, gravel-covered expanse of the hotel's roof. The city of Los Angeles spread out around him, a hazy, sprawling panorama under the unforgiving afternoon Sunday. The roof was a forgotten, industrial landscape. 4 massive, cylindrical water tanks, each about 10 feet tall and painted a peeling, faded black, stood like ancient, silent monoliths against the sky. They were the source of the hotel's water, the cisterns that fed every tap, every shower, every toilet in the building below. Miguel's job was to check the intake valves and the pumps, to see if there was a blockage. He started with the tank closest to the access hatch. Everything seemed normal. He moved to the second, and then the third. Finally, he approached the 4th and final tank, the one furthest away, tucked into a corner of the roof. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The circular, heavy-duty access hatch on the top of the tank, a lid that should have been sealed tight, was not. It was sitting slightly ajar, a dark, crescent-shaped gap visible between the lid and the rim of the tank. A flicker of annoyance passed through him. Some kid, probably one of the transients who sometimes managed to find their way to the roof, must have been messing around. With a heavy sigh, he climbed the rusting fixed ladder that ran up the side of the tank. The metal was hot to the touch. He reached the top and stood on the narrow metal platform that encircled the hatch. He gripped the heavy metal handles on the lid and, with a grunt of effort, lifted it. It was heavier than it looked, a solid piece of steel that took all his strength to move. He slid it to the side, opening the dark, circular mouth of the tank. He peered inside. The water level was low, which explained the pressure problems. The interior was dark, the water murky and still. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his tool belt and aimed its beam into the depths. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling particles of sediment and rust. And then, it landed on something else. Something that was not a pipe, not a valve, not a piece of machinery. It was a shape, pale and indistinct, submerged a few feet below the surface. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. It was a mannequin, he thought. A prank, a piece of trash. But as his eyes adjusted, as he stared into the dark, silent water, the horrifying truth began to dawn. It was not a mannequin. It was the submerged, unmistakable outline of a human body. Miguel recoiled, a strangled cry catching in his throat. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, his flashlight clattering onto the metal platform. He scrambled down the ladder, his feet slipping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the roof access hatch and ran, a terrified, frantic messenger, carrying a truth that was far more foul and terrifying than anyone in the hotel below could have possibly imagined. Night fell on the Sterling Hotel. But this was a new kind of darkness, one punctuated by the harsh, sweeping beams of police floodlights. The rooftop, once a forgotten, desolate space, had been transformed into a meticulous, brightly lit, and deeply somber outdoor laboratory. The air was cool and carried the distant, ceaseless hum of the city, a sound that was a stark contrast to the focused, almost reverent silence of the forensic team. Detective Calvin Rogers stood near the edge of the roof, a silent, grim observer, watching the methodical, almost balletic movements of the investigators in their stark white personal protective equipment. The scene was one of pure, dispassionate procedure. The focus of all activity was the 4th water tank, which now stood isolated in a wide circle of yellow police tape. A large industrial pump had been hoisted to the roof, its thick hoses snaking into the dark, open mouth of the tank. With a low, mechanical roar, the pump came to life, and the slow, painstaking process of draining began. The water, murky and dark, was pumped out into a series of filtration screens, a grim search for any potential evidence that might have been submerged with the body. The process took hours. Rogers watched, his expression unreadable, as the water level inside the tank slowly, inexorably, dropped. The investigators moved with a practiced, respectful efficiency. They took water samples, documented the state of the hatch, and placed small, numbered evidence markers on the rooftop. A single discarded work glove near the tank's ladder, a set of fresh scuff marks on the gravel, a half-empty pack of cigarettes tucked behind a ventilation unit. Each marker was a small, silent question in the larger, horrifying puzzle. As the water level reached the bottom, the full, tragic reality of the scene was revealed. The body of Imani Green lay at the base of the tank, her form a heartbreakingly small and fragile shape in the vast industrial space. And floating near her, a small, sad island of color in the grim, metallic landscape, was her red hoodie, the same one she had been wearing in the ghostly, viral elevator footage. The draining was a process of revelation, stripping away the dark, murky water to reveal a cold, hard, and undeniable truth. There was no more speculation, no more theory. The missing honors student had been found. Dr. Aisha Cole, the forensic pathologist, was present, her compassionate but professional gaze taking in the scene, her mind already beginning the scientific process of understanding what had happened here. The final act of the rooftop drama was the recovery itself. It was conducted with a profound, almost sacred gravity, a team of investigators carefully and respectfully removing Imani's body from the tank. The silence on the rooftop was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a city siren and the quiet, professional commands of the forensic team leader. The draining of the tank was more than just a procedural step in a homicide investigation. It was the draining of all ambiguity, all doubt, all hope. It was the final, terrible confirmation of a mother's worst fears and a detective's darkest suspicions. The discovery on the rooftop of the Sterling Hotel created a media firestorm. The story had all the elements of a modern urban horror story: a beautiful, missing student, a notorious haunted hotel, and a bizarre, gruesome conclusion. The LAPD, under intense public pressure to provide answers, moved quickly to control the narrative. A press conference was called, and a high-ranking police captain, a man with a politician's smooth delivery, stepped up to the podium to deliver the official version of events. He began by confirming the tragic news. The body found in the water tank was indeed that of Imani Green. He offered condolences to the family and praised the tireless work of the investigators. Then, he moved to the heart of the matter, the cause of death. He cited the preliminary findings from the coroner's office, delivered by Dr. Aisha Cole. The initial examination by the medical examiner, the captain stated, his voice firm and authoritative, has found no evidence of physical trauma, no signs of a struggle or assault. The cause of death has been ruled as an accidental drowning. He then skillfully wove this finding together with the one piece of evidence the entire world had already seen: the elevator video. As many of you know, he continued, the security footage from the night of Miss Green's disappearance showed her exhibiting highly unusual and erratic behavior. Based on this footage, and in the absence of any evidence of foul play, the department has concluded that this was a tragic accident, likely precipitated by a sudden and acute mental health crisis. We believe Miss Green, in a state of confusion, made her way to the rooftop, entered the water tank on her own, and was unable to get out. The narrative was neat, it was tidy, and it was, from a public relations standpoint, perfect. It explained the inexplicable. It turned a potential homicide into a sad but self-contained tragedy. And most importantly, it absolved the Sterling Hotel of any direct responsibility. The case, the captain announced, was now officially closed. Lorraine Green watched the press conference from a television in her temporary hotel room, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The official narrative was a profound, soul-crushing betrayal. They had taken her brilliant, stable, and ambitious daughter and branded her a lunatic. They had dismissed her death as a simple, sad accident. Her grief, which had been a raw, open wound, was now mixed with a cold, hard, and burning rage. She knew her daughter. Imani was not mentally ill. She was not reckless. Something had happened to her in that hotel, and the police were choosing to ignore it. Detective Calvin Rogers watched the same press conference from the back of the room, his face an impassive mask, his hands clenched into fists in his pockets. He felt a profound, professional disgust. They had taken the path of least resistance, closing the book on a case that was filled with gaping, unanswered questions. How had a 110-pound young woman lifted a steel hatch that weighed nearly 80 pounds by herself? Why were the rooftop alarms disabled? Who had used a maintenance keycard to access the roof at 2:47 a.m.? That night, the official narrative was not an explanation. It was a convenient fiction, a story designed to make a messy, complicated problem go away. The case might be officially closed, but for Rogers, the real investigation was just about to begin. With the Imani Green case officially stamped closed, accidental death, the departmental resources evaporated, the media attention moved on to the next tragedy, and the Sterling Hotel went back to its business of managed decay. But Detective Calvin Rogers could not let it go. The neat, tidy narrative of a psychotic break didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a deliberate, calculated lie. He was a man who believed in evidence, and the evidence, the small, inconvenient facts that the official report had so willfully ignored, was screaming that this was not an accident. Working on his own time, after his official shifts were over, Rogers transformed his small, cluttered desk into the headquarters of an unsanctioned, one-man investigation. He created what he called his ledger, a simple, spiral-bound notebook where he began to meticulously document every inconsistency, every unanswered question, every piece of evidence that contradicted the official story. It was his Bible of doubt, a methodical refutation of the department's convenient conclusion. The first entry in the ledger was the water tank hatch. He had returned to the rooftop with a crime scene technician, a friend who owed him a favor, and they had weighed the steel lid. It clocked in at 78 pounds. Rogers, a fit, 200-pound man, had struggled to lift it himself. The idea that Imani, a slender young woman, could have lifted it, climbed in, and then somehow partially closed it from the inside was, in his professional opinion, a physical impossibility. The second entry was the keycard log. He had fought for weeks to get the full, unredacted access logs from the hotel's reluctant management. When he finally got them, he found it, at 2:47 a.m. On the night Imani disappeared, a master keycard assigned to the maintenance department had been used to open the secure stairwell door that led to the rooftop. The official report had omitted this detail entirely. Someone with authorized access had been on the roof in the middle of the night. The third entry was the employee who had vanished. Rogers discovered that a maintenance worker named Mark Ellison, a man who had been on duty the night Imani disappeared, had abruptly quit his job 2 days later, citing a family emergency. He had left town without picking up his final paycheck. It was a classic red flag, a detail that screamed consciousness of guilt, yet it had never been pursued. Rogers's ledger grew, page by page, a lonely, obsessive catalog of doubt. He re-interviewed the hotel guests, away from the intimidating presence of the hotel management, and heard stories of strange noises on the upper floors, of a general feeling of being unsafe, of a specific creepy maintenance man who had a habit of lingering in the hallways. He cross-referenced the keycard log with the employee schedule and confirmed that Mark Ellison was the only maintenance worker on duty with access to a master keycard at 2:47 a.m. He was building a new case, a shadow case, on a foundation of facts that his own department had chosen to ignore. He was a man at odds with his own system, driven by a quiet, stubborn belief that the truth was still buried somewhere in the Sterling's deep, dark history, and that the convenient, official narrative was nothing more than the final, insulting layer of a much larger, more sinister cover-up. Detective Rogers's unofficial investigation began to peel back the layers of the Sterling Hotel, revealing a history that was not just one of faded glamour, but of a deep institutional malevolence. He realized that to understand what happened to Imani Green, he had to understand the very soul of the building she had died in. He became a reluctant historian of the Sterling's sordid, hidden past. His research started in the dusty, microfilm-filled archives of the city's newspapers. He spent his weekends scrolling through decades of brittle, yellowed articles, searching for any mention of the hotel. What he found was a disturbing, repeating pattern. A young actress found unresponsive in her room in the 1,950 seconds. Her death ruled a suicide despite a lack of evidence. A European tourist who fell from a high-floor window in the 1,970 seconds, deemed an accident even though the window had been painted shut. A long-term resident who disappeared without a trace in the 1,990 seconds, his case eventually dismissed. The Sterling had a long, dark history of guests checking in and never checking out, each death or disappearance a neat, tidy, and ultimately forgotten tragedy. The hotel was a predator, and its management, it seemed, had always been complicit in cleaning up its messes. Rogers's investigation then took him to the city's building and planning department. He spent hours poring over the Sterling's original blueprints and a century's worth of renovation permits. It was here that he found a startling, architectural lie. The hotel's official records listed it as having 12 operational floors, but the original blueprints showed a 13th floor, a detail that had been scrubbed from all modern public records. And he found a series of permits from 2009 for a massive, vaguely described plumbing and electrical renovation of the 5th and 6th floors, after which both floors had been permanently sealed off and taken out of commission. This discovery led him to a retired LAPD detective, a grizzled, cynical man who had worked the downtown beat in the early 2000s. Rogers met him in a dimly lit bar, a place that smelled of stale beer and old secrets. "The Sterling," the old cop said with a humorless laugh. "We called it the Black Hole. Cases went in, but nothing ever came out. Management had a direct line to the higher-ups. Anything that happened inside those walls got buried under a mountain of paperwork. You're wasting your time, kid. That place is a tomb." The old cop's words, meant as a warning, only hardened Rogers's resolve. The sealed-off floors, the historical pattern of accidents, the culture of concealment, it all pointed to an institution that was not just negligent, but actively engaged in a multi-generational cover-up. The hotel was a black hole, designed to swallow evidence, to erase stories. What had happened to Imani was not an isolated incident. It was simply the latest chapter in the Sterling's long, dark, and violent history. Rogers now knew he was not just fighting for justice for one young woman. He was fighting against the ghosts of a dozen others, all of whom had been consumed by the hotel's deep, dark, and well-guarded secrets. The breakthrough that finally cracked the Sterling Hotel's wall of silence came not from an official record or a dusty archive, but from a place of quiet, human fear. Detective Rogers, acting on a hunch from his interview with the retired cop, had begun to discreetly re-interview the hotel's low-level staff, meeting them in coffee shops and parks far from the prying eyes of the hotel's management. Most were still too scared to talk, but one, a soft-spoken, elderly janitor who was nearing retirement, finally broke. He met Rogers on a park bench, his hands trembling, his voice barely a whisper. He told Rogers about the hotel's unofficial policy of not seeing things. He spoke of strange noises, of guests who complained of being followed, and of a specific, creepy maintenance man named Mark Ellison. And then, he gave Rogers the key. He told him that there was another set of security cameras, a private system for the service corridors, that management kept off the official network. The footage, he whispered, was automatically deleted after 7 days, but he had seen Ellison near the IT room the day after Imani disappeared, and he was sure the man had manually wiped the server. This was the lead Rogers had been waiting for. Armed with the janitor's sworn, albeit anonymous, statement, he was able to convince a sympathetic judge to grant him a new, highly specific warrant, to seize the hotel's internal IT servers. The raid was quiet and professional. Rogers and a team of forensic technicians arrived unannounced and, over the furious, impotent protests of Diane Foster, removed the server rack. The forensic work was a painstaking, high-tech archaeological dig. The primary files had indeed been wiped clean, but the hotel, in its cheapness, had never properly maintained its backup systems. Deep within the server's redundant drives, buried under layers of fragmented data, the technicians found what they were looking for. The ghost files from the service corridor camera on the 9th floor time-stamped the night of Imani's disappearance. The recovery process was agonizingly slow. The technicians worked for 2 days, painstakingly stitching together the corrupted data. Finally, they had a viewable, albeit grainy and distorted, video file. Rogers stood behind the lead technician, his heart pounding, as the clip played on the monitor. The footage was from a camera pointed down a long, dimly lit service hallway, the one that led directly to the secure stairwell to the roof. The clip showed Imani, walking hesitantly, looking over her shoulder. And then, a few seconds later, a second figure entered the frame. It was a man in a dark blue hotel maintenance uniform, his face obscured by shadow, but his build and his gait a match for Mark Ellison. He was not walking with her. He was following her, staying just out of her direct line of sight, a predatory shadow in the grimy corridor. On his hip, glinting for just a second in the dim light, was a large ring of keys, a master key ring. Rogers felt a surge of cold, triumphant fury. This was it. The irrefutable proof. The official narrative of a lone, disturbed young woman was shattered. She was not alone. She had been followed, stalked, by an employee with a master key, a man who had access to every locked door, every hidden corner, every secret space in the entire hotel. The digital ghost on the screen was the final, damning piece of the puzzle, the key that would finally unlock the truth of what happened on the rooftop of the Sterling Hotel. The hunt for Mark Ellison was short and methodical. He had not gone far. The U.S. Marshals, acting on a warrant issued by Detective Rogers, located him working a cash-only construction job in a dusty, sun-baked town in the Arizona desert. He had been living under a new name, a ghost who had simply drifted across a state line. He did not resist arrest. His surrender was quiet, almost passive, the weary resignation of a man who had been expecting this knock on the door for months. Back in Los Angeles, in the cold, sterile confines of an LAPD interrogation room, the final act of the investigation unfolded. Ellison sat opposite Detective Rogers, a cup of coffee untouched on the metal table between them. He was a man in his late 30s, wiry and pale, with dull, empty eyes that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He was not an imposing figure, but there was a deep, unsettling stillness about him. Rogers did not start with accusations. He started with the evidence. He was calm, his voice a low, steady monotone. He laid out the case he had built, piece by piece, like a man assembling a complex, deadly machine. He talked about the keycard logs, showing Ellison's master key accessing the rooftop at 2:47 a.m. He talked about the recovered security footage, the shadow in the hallway. He talked about the fingerprints the forensic team had lifted from the inside of the discarded work glove found near the water tank, fingerprints that were a perfect match to Ellison's. For hours, Ellison said nothing, his expression a blank, unreadable mask. But as the weight of Rogers's methodical, irrefutable evidence settled in the small, windowless room, the mask began to crack. A strange, serene, almost beatific smile touched the corners of his lips. He leaned forward, his voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper. "You don't understand," he began, his eyes lighting up with a disturbing, zealous fire. "It wasn't a crime. It was a test, a spiritual test." Over the next hour, he laid out his twisted, delusional worldview. He saw himself not as a predator, but as a guide, a spiritual proctor. He would choose guests who seemed lost or unsteady, and he would subject them to what he called experiments in obedience. He would lure them to isolated parts of the hotel, the sealed-off floors, the boiler room, the roof, under the guise of showing them a secret, special part of the building. His goal, he claimed, was to test their faith, their ability to surrender control to a higher authority, him. He described what had happened with Imani. He had seen her in the lobby, recognized her as a newcomer, and had followed her. He had spoken to her in the hallway outside the elevator, which explained her strange behavior on the video. He had told her he could show her a place with the most beautiful, secret view of the city. He had led her to the roof. The test was simple, Ellison said, his voice devoid of any remorse. The final act of faith. I told her to get into the tank, to cleanse herself in the water, to show she could let go of her earthly fear. She was hesitant. The test. It went wrong. She panicked. The lid was heavy. It was an accident. It was a confession. But a confession wrapped in a thick, suffocating blanket of self-aggrandizing delusion. He admitted to being there, to luring her to her death, but he refused to accept any moral or criminal responsibility. He was not a killer. He was a misunderstood prophet. Rogers listened, his face impassive, as the man confessed to a crime that was, in its cold, calculated, and predatory nature, far more monstrous than he could have ever imagined. The case was finally, truly, closed. The trial of Mark Ellison was a brief, chilling affair. Faced with his own videotaped confession and the mountain of forensic evidence Rogers had compiled, he accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to manslaughter and evidence tampering. The confession, with its bizarre, pseudo-spiritual justifications, painted a clear picture of a predator who had used the Sterling Hotel's institutional decay as his personal hunting ground. He was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, a quiet, anticlimactic end to a story that had begun with such a loud public mystery. The true sentence, however, was handed down to the Sterling Hotel itself. The revelations from the investigation, the decades of negligence, the pattern of concealed deaths, the active obstruction of a police investigation led to a firestorm of lawsuits and a citywide public outcry. The hotel's license was revoked, its doors padlocked, its remaining residents unceremoniously evicted. The once glamorous Art Deco tower became a true ghost, its windows dark, its grand entrance boarded up, a 12-story tombstone in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. As a final, symbolic act, a city work crew ascended to the rooftop and welded the water tank hatches shut, sealing the grim monument to a tragedy that should never have happened. But Imani Green's story did not end there. Her mother, Lorraine, a woman who had transformed her profound private grief into a powerful public crusade, refused to let her daughter's memory be defined by the darkness of the Sterling. She channeled her anger and her sorrow into action. A year after the trial, she stood before a crowd of reporters and activists and announced the formation of the Imani Foundation for Missing Students. The foundation's mission was simple and profound: to advocate for mandatory safety and security standards in budget hotels and student housing facilities across the country. Lorraine, the retired nurse, became a tireless, articulate, and formidable advocate, lobbying lawmakers, meeting with hotel industry executives, and sharing her daughter's story as a cautionary tale. She fought for mandatory background checks for all hotel staff, for functional, regularly inspected security camera systems, and for transparent reporting of all on-site incidents. Her grief had become her purpose. Back in Los Angeles, Detective Calvin Rogers was transferred, at his own request, to the Cold Case Division. He had solved the Imani Green case, but the victory felt hollow. He had exposed a killer and brought down a corrupt institution, but he hadn't been able to save the victim. His office was a small, windowless room filled with the files of the forgotten, the ghosts of other cases that had been left behind by a system that was too overburdened, too indifferent, to listen. On his new desk, propped up against a stack of old files, was a small framed photograph of a smiling, vibrant young woman with a bright, promising future. It was a picture of Imani, sent to him by her mother. It was a reminder of the human cost of a puzzle solved too late, and a quiet, personal promise that he would keep listening for the whispers, for the threads, for the other ghosts who were still waiting for their stories to be told. Canvas,